Hello. Thank you for joining us for ShipIt. This is our virtual gathering where we bring Shopify folk together to talk about the things we're working on and take questions from all of you that decide to join us today. With conferences being postponed and things going virtual, we wanted to create a place where we can connect with you. My name is Anita Clark, and I'm the managing editor of Shopify's engineering blog. Today, we're talking about our brand new open source release, Packwerk. My guests on the team that investigates ways to make our Rails monolith more modular. There's a lot of cat wrangling going on here. We've got our core monolith has over 2.8 million lines of code and over 500,000 commits over its lifetime. Rails doesn't provide a pattern or tooling for managing the inherent complexity in a structured and well-bounded way. To talk about how we manage this issue with Packwerk, we have Maple and Philip with us. Feel free to ask any questions in the chat anytime during the presentation, and we'll get to them afterwards. Awesome. Let's get started, and I'm excited for this. So thanks for being here, Philip and Maple.
My name is Maple.
And my name is Philip. We're both developers on the architecture patterns team here at Shopify.
So today we're going to share with you all a project we've been working on for the past year or so. Before we begin though, Philip, I was told that sometimes you have nightmares about software architecture. This is true.
Well, it's a bit embarrassing, but it's true. I had a dream where I was working on a code base that was impossible to understand, like really impossible, and nothing made sense. I tried to add a line of code, but I ended up breaking random tests that I didn't even understand what they were testing.
That is not so far off from the reality that developers experience working with what we like to call spaghetti code.
It is not. This really happens a lot in large-scale Rails applications because there's not a lot of structure by default. Take a look at the default Rails folder setup that we have here on the slide. This doesn't tell you anything about what the application does, just that it's implemented in models, views, and controllers. Also, these are just folders, so there are no enforced boundaries between those units.
We want boundaries in our software, just like in real life. Imagine an application that does two things, serving an online store to buyers and letting merchants manage a store behind the scenes. Having a boundary between the different parts of an application would make the whole codebase easier to understand and maintain.
So a first step in that direction is to improve the Rails folder structure like this. We partitioned this Rails application into component folders that look like little Rails applications. Like they could be Rails engines, for example. For people working on just one part of this, or like a small set of parts, it makes the code base feel much smaller. And you know what we always say on our team, Rachel? The smaller the code base,
the happier the developers that work at them. It's true, is it not? However, having these tools is not very helpful if the code doesn't really reflect the structure. So we built a tool to enforce those boundaries in Rails application. We call it Packwerk, or as Philip says it,
Packwerk. The idea for Packwerk came from a conversation with developers working on a similar tool at Stripe. I thought the approach was really interesting, so we expanded on the idea and made it compatible with Rails apps. So how does Packwerk work? It scans application code for constant references statically. Let's take a look at the following code. When Packwerk is confronted with a file like this, the first thing it does is extract all the constant references.
Packwerk also understands active record associations as constant references. So in this example, Packwerk knows that the shop class is referring to the product constant through the has many association. That said, you must be wondering, what does Packwerk do with these constants?
It interprets static references as dependencies. If we know that a file refers to a constant defined in another file, we know that there's a dependency between these files. If the files are in different packages, that means it's a dependency between packages. Packwerk looks for all of these dependencies and enforces properties of the resulting graph.
So we want to know which package a constant is defined in. But first, it would be helpful if we know which file it is defined in. Introducing Zeitwerk.
If you didn't already know, Zeitwerk is a new autoloader used in Rails 6. It is responsible for loading constants, so it has to know which file a constant is defined in.
Zeitwerk has conventions for how constant names map to file paths. So for example, the constant products context item context maps to the file path products context item context.rb relative to an auto-load path. Using the very same convention, we're able to infer the file path from the constant name in Packwerk.
Now, sadly, we can't just reuse Zeitwerk's constant resolution. Because Zeitwerk doesn't separate resolving constants from loading them, we re-implemented constant resolution in Packwerk following the same conventions. This is, of course, slightly annoying, but it allows us to resolve constants without loading them, making Packwerk a whole lot faster.
Now let's talk about how we're using Packwerk at Shopify. As you may already know, Shopify's core codebase is a huge Rails monolith. Well, it's 2020, and we've already split our codebase into components folders back in 2017. What else were we up to between 2017 and 2020? If you're curious, there's a blog post that Phil wrote 2 weeks ago on the current state of our monolith.
One of the things I mentioned in the blog post is that we are taking our monolith to the next level of modularity using Packwerk. Currently, we are running it in CI to enforce boundaries between the components and defining a target dependency graph that we want to move towards. Like this. So wait a minute. What's the deal with components and packages? Are those the same thing?
That is a great question. Components by themselves are just folders that contain a large amount of domain code with boundaries that are not enforced. So right now, we've made all the component folders into packages for Packwerk, and we've also have some smaller packages within those components.
That makes sense. So packages can be as small as we want.
Yep, that's our motto. All good things come in small packages.
That's true.
So how do we use packages to enforce boundaries?
For each package, the team can specify its dependencies. Packwerk will then make sure this package doesn't depend on any other packages that are not specified as dependencies. They can also enable privacy enforcement, which will prevent other packages from referencing a package's internal constants. But as you may imagine, this produces a lot of violations in our legacy code.
Exactly. That's why enforcement is disabled by default, and we're letting teams working in our main monolith explicitly opt in for now. We can't fix everything at once, so these features only make sense if the teams are committed to fixing and refactoring their code. So aside from defining Packwerk-specific configuration, teams can also put metadata into the package, like contact information such as team name and Slack channels. So rather than having just one contact for a huge component, we can have more granular ownership for each package. Now let's talk about another one of Packwerk's other features, which is the deprecated references list.
So people usually look for tools like Packwerk when they begin to feel the pain of growing complexity in their code. You probably already work on a large-scale Rails codebase if you're interested in adopting Packwerk, although you can use it from the start in a small one too. But that means you can't just transform it into a well-organized packages with strong boundaries overnight if you have a large code base. Luckily, Packwerk is prepared for this. It can generate a list of deprecated references that violate the specified rules around dependencies and privacy, and then ignore those references going forward. The list can be used to stop the bleeding and allow developers to refactor the code in small steps, working off the list.
So this is an example of what the deprecated references file will look like. Using Packwerk in our core monolith has slowly but steadily improved the code quality. We often find ourselves having interesting discussions between various teams that result in better understanding of their domain and subsequently also results in better software architecture decisions.
It also showed us some patterns that we were missing by looking at the most common types of violations. For example, we noticed that it is hard not to reuse active record objects across packages for all kinds of reasons, and our GraphQL implementation is too tightly coupled to the persistence layer.
Packwerk is not just used in our core code base, actually. The shipping team at Shopify used Packwerk to extract a component into a separate service. More specifically, they use the deprecated references list, as you see up there, to find and remove dependencies to and from the component.
Having the list of deprecated references helped us understand the relationship between the main application and the component that we were extracting, guiding the design of the API that we needed to move it into a service.
Yeah, so as I was saying earlier, buyers browsing an online store and merchants managing that store are two completely different things. The online store is mostly read-only and gets a lot of traffic, while the store management interface is the opposite of that because only the merchants touch it.
It makes sense to split out the online store so we can optimize for these requirements and scale the infrastructure separately from the rest of the application. And you can use Packwerk to do this kind of thing. So Packwerk can't just be used to modularize a monolith. The resulting modularity also makes it easier to extract parts of the application into a separate service later. Okay, but now for the really exciting part. Let's show Packwerk in action.
I have a demo coming right up.
Does it work?
Alrighty, so we have two packages here. One is building and the other is vehicle. So both packages have a package.yaml file in their folder, which indicates it is a package. And also for both package, we have both privacy and dependency enforced, as you can see here and here. So within each of the package, there is one class. So for vehicle, we have truck, which is just an empty class. And for building, we have house, which has a simple initialization method. So let's see what happens when we run Packwerk check. No offenses detected. So this is expected because there are no offenses in any of these classes. So let's comment this out and uncomment this. So what we're doing here is we are referring to a private constant vehicle truck, which is this class right here. Let's see what happens when we run Packwerk check again. And Packwerk detects an offense. Again, this is because the package building house is referring to vehicle truck, and it is a private constant. So there are two ways we can get rid of this offense. So the first way is to essentially make vehicle truck a public constant and declare a dependency from building onto the package vehicle. So what we want to do first is take truck, this class, and move it into the public folder. So at public, anything under at public is considered a public constant for that package. And then the next thing we want to do is declare the dependency on vehicles within buildings. So what we're saying here is essentially the building package has a dependency on the vehicle package. So let's see what happens when we run Packwerk check again. No offenses. So that is what you want to do if this is indeed a valid dependency of if vehicle is a valid dependency of models building. But if it is not, let's explore another alternative. So let's move this back out and comment out the dependency. And we're back to just having Packwerk check erroring out. So to do so in legacy applications, there are bound to be offenses and violations. We want to encourage people to stop the bleeding, and we can do so by running Packwerk update. So what Packwerk update does is it creates a deprecated references.yaml file for packages with violations. And what it is a shit list for basically all the violations within that package. So as you can see here, Packwerk has these this constant as a violation for dependency and privacy. And we can see that this is indeed the file that that the private constant was called in. So this line right here. So yeah, so let's run Packwerk check to see that it recognizes this list, and now no offenses are detected. So what we are encouraging developers to do is to, first of all, stop the bleeding by having this list, and then slowly refactor your code and work off the list.
Yeah, so if you think this looks interesting, you're in luck. And Maple, you're muted again for some reason.
Sorry, because Packwerk is now open source. Is the slide? Can you see the slides?
Yeah, I think now. Yes.
Okay, cool. So we're really curious to hear your thoughts on it and how you're using it, and looking forward to your contributions. We already got, I believe, 2 or 3 open pull requests, so that's pretty cool. For now, we're happy with the tool, and we're mostly looking to polish user experience and improve documentation. As we learn more about the problem space, we will be evolving it further.
That's cool. So if I was a new user, how would I get started with Packwerk?
That's easy. After installing the gem, just run Packwerk init in the Rails application, and it generates the necessary configuration for you. To turn a folder into a package, you can just create an empty package.yaml file in the folder.
And once you have decided what your packages are, you can start enforcing dependencies and privacy by modifying the package YML and adding restrictions.
So a huge shout out to our team members who worked on Packwerk, both past and present. If you're interested in anything related to software architecture, come join us at Shopify. We would love to have you on our team.
Again, we welcome any contributions and bug reports or PRs that you may have. Let us know what you think of Packwerk and how you are using it in your own Rails applications by tagging us or commenting on our blog posts. So now go forth and
package all the things.
Oh my God, you guys are awesome. Thank you. Thank you for this. This is great. Yeah, so fun. So we have questions. So you guys can ask questions in the chat. Make sure you tag them with questions so we can wrangle them in the background. I do have to ask you, Philip, how was my pronunciation of Packwerk? Did I get it German enough? I practiced
it's
a lot.
apparently really difficult for North Americans.
It is. The tongue just does not work. But anyways, question time. Let's start with our first question. So Tarek wants to know, sorry for the early question. And Tarek, we always love early questions, so do that every time you join us. Does Packwerk depend mostly on Zeitwerk to drawing the
No worries. So I think I can take this one. We considered basing it on Sorbet, but when we started working on this, Shopify wasn't fully committed to Sorbet yet, and we didn't really know. We had a team working on Sorbet, and we were pretty invested in it, but we didn't know that it would actually work out in the long term. So we decided to not depend on Sorbet for this and implement our own static inference essentially. But I always expected that if we go with Sorbet long term and Sorbet is gets better over time, that we at some point would switch out the backend. Yeah, hasn't happened so far, but could happen anytime.
Great. Our next question, Paulo, no, Packwerk is not 19 years old. I guess you guys have been working on it for a year now, and it just launched on Wednesday. So really it's 7 days old in terms of it being alive out of the Shopify womb. Our next question is, Do you specify self.use relative model naming on your component/packages modules? And do you have any other tips for working effectively with Rails naming and inflection under modules?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question. Do you specify what exactly?
It's called.
There it is.
Yes. Sorry. I don't know how I can do these in English very well. These like constant naming things. So, but the question is there. So hopefully that clears it up, that you can come up with a good answer. And you're gone again, Philip. Why are you leaving us? Did I say something?
Yeah, I don't know. It displays to me that it says I have a low connection.
As long as your audio's here, so.
Yeah, I'm still here. So actually, I'm not quite sure what use relative model naming is. I'm wondering if this is related to some kind of problem with namespacing. But like in general, maybe if I can't answer that exact question, I will answer a slightly different one, which is like Packwerk doesn't require you to namespace things correctly. So not all things in the same package need to be in the same namespace. And we explicitly did that to more effectively be able to use it on legacy code. We do write all our new code in that way, though, that it is like there's one namespace per package, and all the new code goes into that namespace. And we've done some, like sometimes we do specify table names explicitly in the models, but to be honest, I don't know what use relative model naming is, so I can't really answer that question.
Actually, Andrew's followed up, and thank you for doing that, Andrew. So I was going to tell you to follow up if possible. And he is saying the question was, if you end up working with names like vehicle, truck, instead of just truck under your component namespace. Does that help you here, Andrew?
Yeah. So.
Oh, and whether you have some experience dealing with some of the magic that Rails does around finding things automatically by name.
I believe Zeitwerk does that, right?
Yeah, so I mean, it depends on what part of the magic Andrew is referring to. There's like, as we explained, there is like this mapping of namespaces to folders, which Rails does, which people sometimes have a problem with, like, or dislike, because if you have a deeply nested namespace path, you need to have a deeply nested folder path too. And with our component structure, like we might have the component name actually twice in the file path, because one is the component and then one is the namespace. And we've just accepted that. We didn't want to modify the autoloader, which would have been a solution. And the other thing is that the vehicles truck, the only thing that I can think of where this becomes relevant is maybe mapping an active record model to a table. So if the model is namespaced, the table could be namespaced too, and usually we want to do that anyway. So I feel like I still misunderstand the question, probably.
Yeah, I hope that helps you a bit, Andrew. If not, ask again, and we'll try and clarify that for you. Our next question is kind of going back to the first question, and they're asking if we've tried doing this with Sorbet first, or have we tried using this with Sorbet? Sorry.
So I believe that it does recognize Sorbet. I want to say like interface, right, Philip? And
the Sorbet type signatures.
Yeah, type signatures. Yeah, we thought about potentially integrating it with Sorbet, but we didn't go down that path.
Yeah. So the advantage here is that we're just statically scanning the code, and the Sorbet type signatures are are just Ruby code. So any type that is mentioned in the type signature is also a constant reference. So Packwerk understands those, and that's actually quite useful.
Cool. So let's move on to our next question. Camilo asks, thanks for saying that it's a great tool, and wants to know, how long have you been using Packwerk, and can it be considered mature?
Do you want to take this, Philip?
Okay, sure. So we've been.
It was an awesome pass the buck, Maple. I just like tears.
So we've essentially been using Packwerk on a small scale since we started developing it. Like we didn't develop it in isolation. We developed it while applying it to code. But especially like the first time that we had people that were not directly developing Packwerk using Packwerk was probably at the beginning of this year. I don't know, February or March. So that's how long we've been using it. Can it be considered mature or stable? Yeah, I think it can be considered mature or stable, but it's so one thing that's important to know, and that's also specified in the documentation in the repo, is that it has some limitations, and we designed it in a way specifically to not be like, it doesn't guarantee, like if Packwerk doesn't find violations, that doesn't guarantee that everything is well. We did design it in a way that it accepts false negatives, so it might not find some of the things that are wrong. But that's because like it's really hard to build something for a static analysis tool for Ruby that is 100% correct, and we put the focus on avoiding false positives. So Packwerk should never tell you that something is wrong when actually nothing is wrong, and it should find like the overwhelming majority of things that are wrong. But it's not complete in that it doesn't find everything that might be wrong. And yeah, regarding stability, it works. Like we're using it on a large scale. And we're not currently planning any large modifications to it, so I would say it's stable. Yeah.
Great. Our next question is: it seems that a team should first break an app into components. What would happen if the Rails app is not broken into components, but is the regular Rails structure?
So I believe you can still create packages, even if you don't have components. You just have to place a package.yaml file within that folder structure that you want to be a package.
Yeah, so theoretically any folder can be a package, any folder with code. The only limitations that I can think of is that if your folders, like if your packages don't have the structure of an engine, that means they're probably not containing their own tests, in which case you would have to exclude tests from the analysis, because tests would be like external code that's reaching into the package. But that works. Like you can apply Packwerk just to your actual production code.
Awesome. Okay, on to our next question. Is the component file structure with a mini Rails app engine in each folder required to use Packwerk?
No, it's not. Currently, our component folders at Shopify, not all of them are Rails, and all of them are packages. So you could have a package within a folder that is not a Rails engine.
Great, moving on. We recently stated that Shopify has 37 components, or was it packages? Do you use packages around components, or do you use them within components? And what are the correct approximate numbers of each? I don't know if you guys can come up with that last one off the top of your head, but
yeah. So components, I think there's still 37 components. So components for us are folder structures that contain a lot of domain code. So for example, a component that we have is platform. And all of them, we created a package within that folder, making so that Packwerk recognizes that component as a package. But within those components, you could have smaller packages, which is what we kind of want, because we want to break down the code into smaller packages. Do you use them within components? Yes. And what are the correct approximate numbers of each? I don't know how many packages there are. Definitely more than 37.
I just checked.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it's 48 now in our core monolith.
Awesome. There you go. Resourceful people here that can pull those numbers out for you
immediately.
So next we have, how many files does Shopify scan and how long does it take? They haven't, well, we haven't successfully run yet, but Packwerk found about 28K files, and at the rate it was going, it seems like it would take a while. So like, what are we seeing, I guess, in duration of it running, and how long does it take on average?
I
don't know how many files we have.
I don't either, but I know that we parallelize our runs. So we break them up, and it takes, I want to say, like, I don't even know the time. Do you know, Philip?
I think if you run it locally, it's like 10 minutes for the monolith. So it's a bit of time. It's not fast enough for like a red green refactor cycle or something like that, but it's definitely fast enough for us to use it in CI and block PRs from merging. Also, Maple, we do have a speed up in the works, right?
Yes. So right now we are looking into refactoring how the AST works. So previously we were borrowed into just using, I believe, was it Ruby VM AST? And right now we are switching over to abstract syntax tree, which is, or was it the other way around?
I think like we were using, so we were using a parser from a gem.
Yes.
I don't know which one we used.
Yes.
And we're switching over to the built-in parser from the Ruby VM. Yeah.
Yeah, it's going to take some work to port everything over, but once that is done, it's going to improve the speed by like 5x from what I remember.
Great. Okay, let's move on to the next question. To split a big Rails app, you pack models and service objects and controllers. How is that different from the engines? Sorry, the question will be coming up.
All right. Split.
Its engines are two tools that you can. Engines and Packwerk are two tools that you can both use to make this happen, and you can use them in combination just fine. So, like, you can. There are other ways to set up setups or enforce boundaries between engines than using Packwerk. For example, if you test the engines in isolation, and just don't load the rest of the code, you can be sure that there's no references there. So Packwerk can do this on like incompletely isolated code where there's still some dependencies. And if you can't remove all the dependencies at once, then Packwerk can give you this like stop the bleeding kind of procedure. Also, Packwerk can enforce privacy, so only allow access to certain constants in the engine, and it understands the difference between transient and direct dependencies. Oh, sorry, transitive, I think is the word that I mean, but direct and indirect dependencies. So if like an engine, or let's say a component or a package, let's say a package, depends if a package A depends on a package B, which depends on a package C, and you set that up in engines that require each other through, for example, gem specs, then A would have access to B and C, and with Packwerk it would have only access to B, so it's more strict.
Cool, thank you. Next question. Can you elaborate on the downsides to using private constants? This article, and it's your article, Maple, says there's no trivial way to determine a boundary violation. Could Sorbet do this?
I haven't tried it with Sorbet. I'm not sure. But what I meant when I said there's no trivial way to determine a boundary violation is that we can't, it's hard to make a list of the violations within a code base just by using private constant. So there are two types of boundaries that we care about, which is privacy and dependency, and this also only touches one type of violation. So just having a private constant as a solution for boundary enforcement is insufficient that way.
I can also expand a little bit. Like to give an example, maybe we have a class that's called shop, which is probably not surprising in a company called Shopify, and it has like thousands or 10,000s of references to it across the code base. So if we try to make the shop a private constant, we would have to make one gigantic change, because the constant is only either completely private or completely public. So with Packwerk, we can say, okay, this is public now, and we record all the violations, all the existing references, and that means no new ones can be added, and we can like one by one work off the old ones.
Cool. Okay, thank you. Our next question is, assuming different modules are talking to the same database, have you thought about enforcing data ownership in the future?
Yeah, I mean, that's not really a Packwerk question, I think. That's more like a overall modular monolith question. But so I think active record has a lot of disadvantages for modular monoliths, but an advantage for it is that it's usually the gateway, like one active record class is usually the gateway to one table. And it's very rare that a table is accessed in any other way than through its active record. So because Packwerk can make active records private, and we try to do that wherever we can, we kind of enforce data ownership through that. It's not like airtight, I guess is the word, but it's a good start. And so we've been looking at, but not really in detail, some other stuffs like that. You can theoretically enforce data ownership on other levels of the stack. And we already have some tooling to prevent certain tables from being used, like from being joined together, for example, or being used in the same transaction for sharding purposes. And we could reuse the tooling on components, but we haven't done that yet.
Okay, moving on. Is there a checklist you use in order to decide what goes into a component? Are there best practices on how to split a Rails app into component and draw boundaries?
Phil, you're the father of componentization here at Shopify. You would know.
So I think there are two questions in here. Best practices is a little hard because like we're still experimenting with large parts of this. But like in terms of, so two things I think I can say. So one thing I mentioned in my blog post too is that like you might want to consider, depending on what's most important to you, you might want to consider just like creating new components from scratch, essentially new components that are empty, and then growing them over time, which makes it easier to keep a strong boundary in place. Or you might want to consider, as we did with our main monolith, just cutting the whole thing into components so that nothing is left that's not in a component, and then enforcing the boundaries, making them stronger over time. For us, we had like hundreds of people working on this monolith, so it was important to just delineate areas of responsibility in a way for the teams. So like by cutting everything into components, we could say, okay, this team owns these components, this team owns those components. I mean, we try to not be interpret too much into the concept of ownership. Like everybody should be should own the whole code base. We all own the code base together, but there are some teams that are like more like stewards. So they essentially have the vision for a part of the code base. So those are like the two ways. Either you start with big components or you start with small components. And then what goes into a component? We have a simple checklist that is like, it's the question is more like, when do you create a new component? But I think it kind of answers the question. So we say that it has to have a clearly defined domain of business. And our smell test is, could you make a successful startup business from this one domain? The name represents the domain in a ubiquitous language. Responsibilities are not blurred among existing component domains, and it contains both business logic and state. So if it was only business logic, we would probably just turn it into a gem.
Great. And this is kind of a follow-up to this question. First of all, Lee wants to say that this is great and wants to thank you guys for open sourcing this. Thanks, Lee. We appreciate that. The question is, can you share any learnings or approaches you took to find boundaries? And can you speak to boundary and team alignment?
So we had a previous project, I think I mentioned it in the presentation, where we and the shipping team were trying to isolate a package. So we did summarize a couple of strategies that we commonly used to break those boundaries. We were initially going to publish a blog post about that too, but we ended up not doing that. So maybe in the future we can share that.
You shouldn't have said that out loud. Now I'm going to be like a dog with a phone coming after you. Thank you.
Can you also speak to boundary and team alignment? One thing that I wanted to bring up is that when we worked with the other team, it required definitely context on the stuff that you're breaking out, because our team was just we were offering like Packwerk as a tool to help them break out that I don't want to say service, but that package. And it definitely required a lot of context on what the package does in order to refactor it the right way. But yeah, if you have anything else to add, Philip.
Yeah, I mean, my picture seems to have disappeared again, but
yeah, it's kind of hilarious. You're like a ghost that comes in every once in a while, but you're always here.
Your voice is here.
Occasionally.
Always here.
Always watching.
So especially with the componentization and like cutting the code base into components, the first steps that we took on our core monolith, we looked to the ideas from domain-driven design, and I mean, in my opinion, like the main benefit that we get from this is that like the amount of context that a single developer needs to have in their head is smaller. So it makes sense for each component to have like a team assigned that has like most of the domain context around this. And I wouldn't like, I don't think it makes sense to say that it needs to be one-to-one. Like each component needs to have exactly one team, and each team needs to have exactly one component. But it makes sense. It just reduces friction if the boundaries line up in a way. And I think if you go with domain-driven design ideas of bounded contexts and so on, that will just happen by itself, because like you would have teams responsible for areas of the business, and you would have components responsible for areas of the business. And at least for us, it worked out really well, because when we started componentization, there was an independent project going on at the same time to split the company into product lines. And we just assigned components to product lines. It's as I said, it's not one-to-one. Product lines usually own or steward more than one component, but it works out quite well.
Great, thank you. Another question, and this kind of like ties into the last series of questions here. And again, there's another thank you from Dean. He's thanking you guys for open sourcing this. It's really nice. We're getting so much thank yous in one of these. This has never happened. And the question is not really related to Packwerk, but if you could share what strategies you're using or considering for communicating between packages. For example, in process via normal calls, or do you use other techniques like gRPC, REST, and messaging?
So again, I think this is like it's not a Packwerk question necessarily, but I can take it. So Packwerk itself does not make any assumptions about this. It knows about constant references, and it doesn't even care about method calls. So it kind of works whatever you decide to use. But yeah, I mean, we started with a huge code base that obviously by default just used method calls. So overwhelming majority of communication between components is definitely still method calls. We investigating using something like GraphQL to communicate between components, but it just seemed in our experiments to be way too heavy-handed. It's like, yeah, it's just so there's degrees of coupling, right? And if you want the highest, like the lowest degree of coupling, then you would probably deploy things differently and have total separation of the database, and that means you have separate services. The reason to have a modular monolith instead is that you accept some coupling because it gives you a better cohesion. So we mostly use method calls, and I think it will stay that way. But we've been experimenting with some kind of publish and subscribe mechanism internally. It's not anything that we can, I think, publicly talk about yet. If we even
just
go.
Have.
Yeah. Anyway, we've been considering we've been considering it. And I'm just, what I want to say is just that I like, we might not actually do this. But it seems like a good idea to have some publish and subscribe like mechanism, because that's also what allows you to do inversion of control, which you probably want to do if you want to end up with a dependency graph that doesn't have cycles. So it's just that I don't think techniques like dependency inversion or inversion of control are very common in Rails apps, and many of the patterns that are common are actually incompatible with them. So it's not super easy, and it's definitely an area of ongoing investigation for us.
Awesome, thanks. Next question. Are there any compatibility issues when using Packwerk with Rails versions before 6 due to differences in the constant resolution?
Yes. Packwerk works with Zeitwerk, and Zeitwerk comes with Rails 6. So unless your Rails version also is compatible with Zeitwerk, it won't work with Packwerk. it won't vac with Packwerk.
Sorry, folks that aren't using anything. Get on 6. That's what I guess the message is here if you want to get with Packwerk. Okay, next question is, how do you contrast or differentiate Packwerk with something like a dry system? Do you guys know dry system? Do you want me to share this link with you?
Yeah, the last time I looked at dry system is quite some time ago. If I remember correctly, dry system is very opinionated in terms of, yeah, so I hope this is not wrong, but if I remember correctly, the approach that dry system takes is that essentially to avoid all static references and inject everything. And there's some kind of global dependency registry. I don't remember, but it's a more dynamic approach than what we are doing. So what we are doing is essentially saying, like, by default, Rails applications have too many static dependencies internally, but we don't need to get rid of all of them. If we just turn the graph from like a big ball of mud into something that is understandable and a little bit less dense and doesn't have any cycles, that should give us most of the benefits for a much smaller amount of work.
Awesome. Okay, I just wanted to let everyone know out there that we have 5 minutes left. If you have any questions, get them in pretty right now. Our next question is, do you have any docs on how to parallelize the check?
So just to clarify, when I mentioned we have our checks parallelized, that is on CI. So we broke up like the folders and run them in separate, I guess, containers or runs. So that speeds up the process by a bit. You can also run check for an individual package or folder with Packwerk check and then the folder name. But yeah.
Yeah, so the slow, like there's two parts of Packwerk. Essentially, one is scanning the code and finding references, and the other one is resolving the references and then checking them against the specified restrictions on the graph. And the second part is super fast. So if you just restrict the number of files that you scan, like if you scan half as many files, it will be twice as fast, essentially. So you can just say, okay, run it on this part of the code base, and separately in a different job, run it on that part of the code base, and it will be twice as fast.
Okay. Our next question is if we have any plans to take advantage of Ruby 3 RBS definitions.
I think that would be a question for our Sorbet team. I think so, but I don't know.
I know, yeah, if any shop folk out there that are, working on Sorbet, they could pop in the chat and drop that answer if you have it.
Anyway, sorry, from a Packwerk perspective. From a Packwerk perspective, the answer is no. I am actually not quite sure how we would use them because those are type signatures. And so if like right now we understand Sorbet signatures because they are just Ruby code. If we remove them and use RBS instead, Packwerk wouldn't by default understand them. It would just ignore them. So that is unfortunate. We'll have to see. Like if we do adopt RBS and remove the signatures from the code, we would have to, I guess, change Packwerk. But I can't really imagine that. So I'm not on the Sorbet team, but as I understand it, for us, one of the big advantages of Sorbet is that we do have the signatures in the code because it's added documentation. So I don't think we will move away from that.
Okay. Our next question is the scanning for references cacheable?
maybe.
Is that like if we had like unlimited time, limited money, it could happen, but because we don't, it doesn't.
Yeah, so I think it would be possible. We actually had a discussion about that I think a week ago or two. But like right now, it's fast enough for us. So I'm not sure we will investigate this further until it becomes too slow for us.
Just to clarify, this Andrew said it's for CI parallelization.
Oh. I don't know how that's related to parallelization, because you wouldn't like there would be no overlap in scanning for references between the parallel jobs. I mean, sure, caching could make CI faster too, but yeah, I don't see the relationship between caching and parallelization right now.
Okay. Our next question is, sorry, I'm just checking this question here. Is there a checklist you use in order to help engineers decide what? Oh, we talked about that already. Sorry. I will follow up on the RBS question because one of our shop folk has answered it in the chat, and I'll just make that available for people who are going to watch this video afterwards. And the answer is we're working closely with the Ruby core team at Shopify to contribute and help development of RBS. We also have preliminary work to marry RBS with Sorbet, so that stuff's kind of ongoing. Our next question is Salvador, who says, this is really exciting stuff, thank you. And he wants to know if they can get a job working on these type of projects at Shopify. And the answer is, of course, yes, always.
Hells yeah.
Check out the career site. There are opportunities there. Also, we have a LinkedIn Shopify engineering group. I would suggest joining that group also. A lot of our recruiters and developers are in that group, and they do reach out to people about jobs that are available there. Always check the blog. We will highlight jobs that are available in these areas with blog, that go along to the blog posts. If, say, there was a job open right now on Maple's team, we would have a link to that post there. So keep your eyes out. Things are popping up all the time. We're always looking for good developers. I don't know if you guys have anything else to add to that. That was my little HR talent spiel for 5 minutes.
Or if you're very keen, you can also make contributions to Packwerk. We have updated issues, so a lot of good first contributor issues. Just trying to.
Yeah, you never know.
We always the work.
We're looking at what's going on in these things and reaching out to people also. So make yourself known to us, and it definitely helps you in a job application. Okay, so we are at the end of this. It's been everyone. I want to thank Philip and Maple for being here and answering everybody's questions. There will be a copy of this event posted on the engineering blog. I'll update it with the video, and when it's available, I'll send that out to everyone that signed up for this event. Again, we talked about hiring. We're digital by default. We're missing our offices, but now our houses are our offices, and you can join us working in your house too. Check what's available on our career site. And finally, I want to thank all of you guys for attending with us. It's been really amazing. We're touched by how many of you guys came out to talk about Packwerk, and I hope you guys get to go out, use the tool, get on the GitHub repo and chat with us. Look at the PRs, solve some PRs like we're looking for you to contribute, and we'll be sending you a survey about this event. We want to make it better, so please let us know your feedback and what you want to see for upcoming events. Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon. Maple, Philip, have a great afternoon too, and we'll see you.
Thanks, Anita.
Thank you, Anita. Thank you, Anita.